The Widow's Watch. The cliffs of the Scottish coast were sharp and unyielding, their jagged edges disappearing into the gray swirl of mist that clung to the ocean. Waves crashed below with a relentless, droning fury, and the lighthouse atop the cliff stood like a lone sentinel, its light cutting through the fog in sweeping arcs. Young widow Elspeth MacLeod lived nearby in a small stone cottage, her eyes always drawn to the distant horizon, waiting for her husband, a sailor lost to the sea months before. Locals whispered that the cliffs themselves were haunted, cursed by the spirits of men claimed by the ocean. Yet Elspeth clung to hope, desperate for a sign of his return. At dusk, she climbed the narrow path to the lighthouse, her lantern flickering in the wind. The air smelled of salt, rain, and something faintly metallic, as if the ocean carried with it fragments of old, unspoken tragedies. She listened to the waves crashing below and imagined the faint creaking of a ship's timbers, wondering if it might be him. The lighthouse beam swung lazily across the sea, and in that fleeting moment of illumination, she thought she saw a shadowy figure on the horizon, standing tall at the prow of a distant ship. Her heart leapt, but the figure vanished as quickly as it appeared, swallowed by the fog and rolling waves. That night, the townsfolk reported strange occurrences. Ships, usually guided safely by the lighthouse, ran aground near the cliffs despite the light sweeping faithfully across the sea. Sailors swore they saw a lone woman standing on the rocks, her lantern beckoning them toward disaster. Rumors spread of the widow's grief twisting into something unnatural, of her longing becoming a force that drew men to the cliffs, indifferent to reason or navigation. Elspeth herself noticed it. Each night, her lantern seemed brighter than any other, its glow unnaturally persistent, almost alive. A local fisherman, old and wary of superstition, warned her one evening as she prepared to light her lantern. "Elspeth, the sea listens to grief, but it does not forgive. Be careful what you call forth." She smiled faintly, not entirely understanding, and continued her vigil. The fog thickened, curling around the cliff edges like fingers, and the lighthouse beam cut through it in stark, silver slices. She felt an eerie sensation, as if the sea itself were whispering to her, carrying messages from beyond, and she shivered. The line between hope and obsession blurred. Each night, her grief seemed to strengthen, her watch becoming less about waiting and more about drawing the world toward her sorrow. In the dead of night, a storm rolled in, lightning flashing across the cliffs, waves smashing violently against the rocks. Elspeth's lantern swayed in the gale, and for a fleeting moment, she swore she saw a shadow at the water's edge, pale and ethereal, beckoning. The wind carried a whisper, almost human. "Come closer. The tide awaits." She froze, heart hammering, knowing that her vigil had attracted forces beyond comprehension. The cliffs were alive with unseen eyes, and the sea seemed eager to claim another soul. That night marked the beginning of a haunting that would entwine Elspeth, the lighthouse, and the restless spirits of the ocean in ways she could neither control nor foresee. The storm had passed, leaving the cliffs slick with rain and a dense, rolling fog that swallowed the horizon. Elspeth MacLeod's lantern burned brighter than ever, its glow piercing the mist with a surreal intensity. From her cottage window, she could see the ocean's surface ripple unnaturally, as if the sea itself were responding to her grief. That night, A small fishing vessel appeared, moving erratically, its captain squinting through the fog. The light from Elspeth's lantern danced on the waves, almost beckoning, and the sailors found themselves unable to resist its glow. The vessel lurched dangerously near the jagged rocks, and the crew shouted warnings to each other, yet their voices seemed swallowed by the mist. Elspeth, unaware of the men's peril, felt a strange pull in her chest, a combination of longing and power she could not name. Her lantern wavered as if it had a life of its own, swinging in wide arcs, casting spectral reflections across the water. A sudden flash of lightning illuminated the scene. The sailors' faces were pale, their eyes wide, not with fear of the storm, but with something deeper, an almost hypnotic fixation on the lighthouse. Elspeth's awareness of her influence grew, the realization settling like a stone in her stomach. Every night she watched, the fog thickened, her lantern's glow drew vessels ever closer to the cliffs, and whispers echoed faintly in the wind, faintly recognizable as the voices of men lost long ago. The line between her grief and the oceans will blurred. The sea obeyed her longing, yet she had no control over the deadly consequences. As she climbed the narrow path to the lighthouse, a shiver ran through her. Shadows at the cliff's edge flickered unnaturally, taking on human shapes, ghostly sailors trapped between life and death, drawn to her mourning. She tried to warn herself, whispering into the wind, "I do not wish harm. I only wait." Yet the mist carried her words back to her, twisted, layered with malevolent intent. The dead seemed to echo her sorrow, amplifying it, turning it into a force she could not resist. Below, the small vessel collided with hidden rocks. A muffled scream traveled up the cliffside, mingling with the shriek of gulls and the crash of waves. Elspeth froze, a tremor of horror piercing her chest, yet she could not look away. The lighthouse light pulsed rhythmically, almost as if beating in tune with the hearts of the doomed crew. By midnight, multiple ships were caught in the fog, drawn by the same unearthly glow. Elspeth stood at the cliff's edge, her heart a mixture of grief, fear, and awe at her own inadvertent power. The wind whispered again, carrying fragments of voices from centuries past, their sorrow entwined with hers. One shadow emerged more distinctly than the others, hovering near the water, a figure resembling her late husband, spectral and translucent, reaching toward her from the waves. Tears blurred her vision, and she felt an irresistible compulsion to respond, to call out, even as rational thoughts screamed to resist. The fog thickened further, tendrils curling toward the cliffs like fingers, and Elspeth realized with growing dread that her mourning had awakened forces older than memory. The ocean seemed alive, attentive, and patient, the spirits of the lost sailors now orbiting her presence, bound by grief, lantern light, and the unbroken vigil she maintained. Every wave, every whisper, every shadow was both invitation and threat, a constant reminder that her sorrow had become a bridge between the living and the dead, and the cliffs would not release their prisoners so easily. The fog clung thicker to the cliffs as Elspeth ascended the narrow path to the lighthouse, each step feeling heavier, as if the very ground resisted her presence. Shadows stretched and warped around her, the mist taking on vague, human forms. From within the rolling haze, whispers emerged again, carrying distinct fragments of sailors' voices. "Please, warnings, and names she had never heard. Her heart thudded in response, an unsettling mix of fear and longing. The spectral forms became more distinct. Pale faces, hollow eyes, skeletal hands reaching as if to grasp her lantern and pull her into the churning sea below. Elspeth tried to look away, but her eyes were drawn to them, and with each glance, the whispers grew louder, pressing into her mind, filling her head with the memories of men who had vanished on these cliffs decades ago. The ocean roared beneath her, and she sensed the spirits stirring, impatient, drawn by her vigil. One figure detached from the fog entirely, moving toward her with a swaying, unsteady gait. Its face was familiar, a reflection of her lost husband, yet impossible, twisted by decay and mist. The lantern's glow flickered, revealing that he was surrounded by countless others, all spectral sailors, all reaching, all calling her silently toward the water. A sudden gust of wind threatened to snatch her lantern from her hands, but Elspeth clutched it fiercely. The figure of her husband raised an arm in a gesture both beckoning and warning. A voice, like wind through rigging, whispered, "Elspeth, come to us. Join the watch." She stumbled backward, nearly losing her balance on the slick cliffside. Her mind swirled with the impossible realization. Her mourning had awakened the spirits, and they were tethered to her grief, bound to her vigil, and now she was tethered to them. Every ship that drew near the cliffs, every sailor that fell victim, reinforced their presence, their hunger for connection, their pull on the living. Her lantern flickered and flared, casting erratic shadows against the lighthouse walls. Elspeth could feel the coldness of the ghostly hands brushing against her arms, the air thick with salt and spectral breath. Each shadow she saw had its own story, its own suffering, and she felt a moral weight pressing down. Her grief, once private and personal, had become an instrument of destruction. The cliffs were no longer a passive landscape. They were a theater, and she, the unwitting conductor, drawing the living into the tragedy of the dead. From below, she heard the faint groaning of timbers and cries from vessels caught in the rocks. The ocean itself seemed to pulse in response to her thoughts, waves rising unnaturally high, tossing the spectral forms around with violent grace. The figures in the fog began moving in a coordinated rhythm, as though rehearsing an ancient, terrible dance, circling her, pushing her toward the lighthouse door. The whispers grew into coherent words, clear and compelling. The tide waits. The watch never ends. You cannot leave. Elspeth realized that she faced a choice, or perhaps an illusion of one. She could flee, but the cliffs and fog would shift, ensuring she returned to the lighthouse, to the watch, to the men lost at sea who now needed her presence. She could resist, but the spectral forms pressed inward, memories of grief and longing intertwining with her own, bending her will. Her hands trembled as she ascended the final steps to the entrance of the tower itself, the lantern flickering like a heartbeat. Inside, she sensed the culmination of centuries of sorrow, the gathering of spirits whose lives had ended violently, all poised to confront her and claim her grief as part of their eternal vigil. The air within the lighthouse smelled of salt, wet stone, and decay. Shadows moved independently of any light, coiling around the central staircase like living smoke. Elspeth took a deep breath and stepped forward, understanding that the threshold she was about to cross would irrevocably entwine her fate with the restless spirits, the cliffs, and the ocean. Somewhere far below, a bell tolled, not from a tower, but from the sea itself, and she felt the pull, inexorable and relentless, drawing her deeper into the widow's watch, toward the climax she could neither foresee nor escape. The lighthouse loomed above Elspeth as she pushed open the heavy wooden door, its hinges groaning like a chorus of long-dead sailors. Inside, shadows clung to every corner, writhing as if alive. Her lantern flickered, revealing a spiral staircase ascending to the lantern room, each step slick with condensation, each echo magnifying the whispers that had haunted her nights. The air was thick with the scent of brine and decay, and a cold pressure pressed on her chest. As she climbed, the whispers coalesced into clear voices, repeating her name, pleading and demanding at once. At the top, she entered the lantern room, a chamber illuminated by the rhythmic sweep of the lighthouse's lamp. The spectral forms of the sailors surrounded her, their hollow eyes fixed on her, as if she were the key to something beyond comprehension. Their hands, skeletal and trembling, reached out toward her, and she felt an irresistible pull toward the center of the room. In the midst of the gathering, the figure resembling her husband stepped forward, his features simultaneously familiar and grotesquely distorted. His eyes glowed with a cold, supernatural light, and a faint, sorrowful smile played across his lips. "Why do you watch?" the figure whispered, voice blending with the wind and the crash of waves below. "Do you not see what your longing has wrought?" Elspeth's voice trembled. I'll wait. I only wish to see you again." "You see," the figure said, stepping closer, "and yet you do not. The sea remembers every grief, every loss. You have called them forth." The ghosts of the sailors shifted, circling her with increasing intensity, their whispers merging into a roar of lament and accusation. The lighthouse beam cut through the fog outside, catching glimpses of ships tossing on hidden rocks, victims of her grief-charged beacon. Elspeth realized with horror that she had become the instrument of their doom. Each night of mourning had strengthened the spectral tide, drawing more lives to the cliffs, feeding the restless dead. A sudden gust of wind slammed the lantern against the wall, extinguishing it. Darkness enveloped her, and the spectral figures advanced, hands brushing against her skin, icy and persistent. She screamed, the sound swallowed by the whispers, her heart racing as the room seemed to tilt, twist, and elongate unnaturally. Time lost meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps centuries, and she felt herself merging with the shadows, her sorrow blending with the collective grief of the dead. One by one, the figures approached, not to harm, but to claim, binding her to the lighthouse and the cliffs. Her husband's ghost took her hand, cold as the depths below, and guided her to the edge of the lantern room. Below, the waves crashed violently, and she glimpsed the tortured spirits of the sailors she had inadvertently drawn, reaching upward in silent despair. Her chest ached with longing and guilt, and she understood that the watch was now hers to maintain, an eternal vigil over the cliffs, the sea, and the living who might one day stray too close. The lighthouse pulsed with spectral energy, the lantern sweeping through fog thickened by centuries of sorrow. Elspeth stood trembling, heart pounding, eyes wide, fully aware of the irreversible bond she had forged. The sea roared, the cliffs whispered, and the ghosts of lost sailors hovered around her, patient and insistent. The widow's watch had begun in earnest, and she knew it would never end. Outside, ships vanished into the mist, drawn by the same light, guided by grief, and destined to join the eternal chorus she now commanded. Dawn crept reluctantly over the cliffs, painting the fog in muted grays and sickly golds. Elspeth MacLeod stood at the top of the lighthouse, her lantern now extinguished, yet the room shimmered with a pale, otherworldly light that emanated from the shadows themselves. The spectral sailors had circled her through the night, their hollow eyes fixed, their hands brushing against her arms, embedding her sorrow into the very stones of the lighthouse. She realized with chilling clarity that she had become an integral part of the cliffs and the sea. Her grief had been transformed into a living, breathing force that no human could ever escape. The wind carried 1,000 whispers, all urgent and mournful, echoing tales of lives lost to the ocean over decades. One by one, the figures of the sailors began to fade into the mist, returning to the sea, yet each glance toward Elspeth made it clear that she was now the keeper of the watch, the conduit between the living and the dead. Even as she tried to step toward the spiral staircase, her feet felt rooted, bound by invisible chains of salt, sorrow, and spectral insistence. The cliffs seemed to lean closer, alive with centuries of accumulated grief, waiting for her next act of vigilance. Far below, the waves tossed a small fishing boat, its crew unaware of the danger looming above. The lighthouse's light pulsed faintly, almost of its own accord, cutting through the fog and drawing the men toward the jagged rocks. Elspeth's chest tightened with dread, yet a strange calm settled over her. She understood the terrible truth. Her love, her mourning, had become an anchor for the dead, a force that would guide the living into the hands of the restless spirits. The boundary between life and death, grief and obsession, was now hers to maintain indefinitely. She turned toward the cliffs, peering into the fog where the spectral shadows lingered, stretching and twisting with unfulfilled longing. Her husband's figure appeared one last time, his expression sorrowful, resigned. He whispered, a voice carried on the wind, "The watch begins, and it never ends. Guard them, guide them, and remember, the sea is patient." The waves responded as if acknowledging the command, rolling rhythmically, eternally, carrying with them the echoes of the lost. Elspeth's eyes filled with tears, yet she raised her lantern, now unnecessary, yet symbolically hers, sweeping it across the mist and cliffs. Hours passed in minutes, or perhaps in timelessness, as the widow's vigil commenced. Ships disappeared into the gray folds of the ocean, their crews entrapped by the invisible rhythm she now maintained. Shadows of lost sailors flitted across the waves, vanishing only to reappear, drawn by the eternal pulse of grief and light. Elspeth remained poised at the lantern, a spectral figure herself now, her presence entwined with the cliffs, the lighthouse, and the restless spirits. Outside, the wind whispered her name, the fog thickened, and the sea, patient and inexorable, waited for the next soul to heed the call. And so, the widow's watch continued, a haunting presence above the Scottish cliffs, the boundary between the living and the dead forever blurred, her sorrow now the eternal guide for sailors, spirits, and anyone who might wander too close to the jagged rocks below. The cliffs were alive, the sea unyielding, and Elspeth MacLeod had become a legend whispered among fishermen, a spectral sentinel whose grief and vigilance could never fade. The end for now.